Good morning. And welcome to our fourth and final plenary session.
That makes sense.
Today's session is called Conducting Prevention Science Research to Achieve Social Justice and Health Equity in Politicized Times, a critical dialogue with health equity researchers. We're really excited to have this plenary session. It's something we're doing a little bit different at SPR conference. So we're using this fourth plenary session as an opportunity to integrate the discussion and the content that's been presented in the first three plenary sessions. So we really think this is a great opportunity to look at the issues of health equity through the lens of intersectionality, and again, bringing together the expertise of all our panelists. We're also very fortunate and excited to have this session moderated by Dr. Carsonia K. Weiss-Whitehead, who's an author, radio host, and a speaker, and an educator. She's also the founding director of the Carson Institute for Race, Peace, and Social Justice, and she's also a professor of communication and African American Studies at Loyola University, Maryland. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Whitehead, who's going to lead us in a guided discussion, but we're definitely going to have some time from the audience to really, I feel there's been a lot of questions and discussion during the conference. So this will be an opportunity to exchange ideas and continue our discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Whitehead.
Thank you. Good morning. So just to give you an outline of how we're going to go about today's conversation, we're going to spend about 30 minutes in discussion hearing from our panelists, and then we're going to open up to questions. I see there are mics in the middle of the floor, and we'll do about a 30-minute Q&A, and then we'll give our panelists the time to make a closing statement. I'm excited to be here. I've been thinking a lot about this topic on my way down from Baltimore City. And in so many ways, when I think about what does it mean to want to be healthy, what does it mean to want to be well, Baltimore City is a place where we are fighting to get better. We're fighting to be healthy. We're trying to figure out what does it mean to actually be so sick for so long that it starts to feel natural. I'm reminded of something that my grandmother said. She was one of the first Black nurses of South Carolina. And she said whenever people would come in to talk with her, they would spend so much time talking about their symptoms without talking about the root of why they were actually sick. And once she got to the root, she asked them, do you know what it feels like to be well? Do you know what the difference is between being sick now and being healthy, and helping them to understand that sometimes you're on a path towards getting better, but you don't even recognize it because you're focused on the symptoms that are making you feel like you are stuck in a cycle of sickness. So today in our conversation, thinking about that, thinking about how to achieve social justice, I am making the argument that America as a whole is very sick. We are suffering from a racial, a class, and a gendered sickness. And it's the work that we're doing both through our research in our classrooms and on the streets, because we have to be, at least what W.B. Du Bois talked about as public intellectuals, even in a small sense of the word, because we have to take the research from the ivory tower to the people who need to hear it. And if that calls upon us to present our research differently so that everyone can understand, then I think the responsibility is on us. If only the people who have degrees can understand what we're talking about, I would argue we're not living up to our highest potential as academics. Because I should be able to write a 45-page article that only 2 people, including my mother, will ever read, and then transfer that to a 750-word op-ed that people will pick up when they're drinking their coffee. Can I take my material and can I synthesize it down? And so today we're going to try to get to the heart of what does it mean to conduct preventative research, teaching to achieve social justice and health equity in politicized times, which I think we can all agree, given what is happening even in this city alone, we're living in deeply politicized times. I want to take a minute to introduce each of the panelists. And I want to ask them, once I introduce them, kind of one at a time, to talk a little bit about your positionality and how that impacts your work. And I'll start down to my left, your right, with Dr. Catherine Thiel. And Dr. Thiel is a professor from Tulane University, the School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. If you could just talk a bit about, 1 to 2 minutes or so about your positionality and how it impacts your work.
Sure. Yes, thank you. As a white heterosexual cisgendered woman with a lot of privilege, I really reflect on this quite often, particularly doing work in health equity space. And I've been doing a lot of this work for decades, but, it is hot now. And so how do I don't want to feel like a health equity tourist as a researcher. And so I think that's really important and something I do struggle with from a positionality perspective. But I think it allows me to also, use that power, use that awareness for better allyship, pushing the needle within my circles, and how can I be a conduit for change. And I think it's also very important, given where I sit, to be in community all the time with those I'm studying. And that includes, hearing the voices, lifting the voices, really having a deep understanding of the needs and the questions that we need to ask. And so that's kind of where I sit and what I struggle with every day.
Thank you very much. I want to move to Executive Director Darlene Flynn from the city of Oakland, Race and Equity Department in California. How are you, Executive Director?
I'm good, thank you. Well, my identities are complicated, but I do identify as a Black cisgendered woman. So we'll start there. But I'm also mixed race. And my mother was white. So I was the first, I often tell a joke that the first person I ever fell in love with was a white woman. So therefore, white women get a little bit of a break, but not forever. And not even my mother, rest in peace. So, but I do think that has a lot to do with why I do the work I do. My parents had to relocate from Missouri as a mixed race couple in love in the early 50s. So they had to get out and they came to Washington. So I was born in Seattle, Washington because of structural and systemic racism, basically. And ever since then, I've been curious about it. And that's how I ended up in this line of work. So that's my backstory. But I also think it positions me to have a unique piece of access to the system that is somewhat white, but very informed by being raised in Black community. Because again, when we moved to Seattle, Washington, we did not move to the green lined areas of the city. My father was most definitely Black, his Black family followed, and we all lived in the central area. So I had a culturally Black experience coming up, even though I had a white mother. So I have the advantages of both. And I think that has just informed my work and my thinking greatly. It's enabled me to bridge in multiple different directions. And it keeps me alert to the complexities of this construct or these constructs that are intersectional and that impacted my mother as a white woman who was a nurse. And back in those days, quite oppressed in that role. You see what I'm saying? So I have all kinds of insights into how systemic oppression works because of how it impacted my family. And I try to bring all that to what I do.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce Dr. John Blosnich, who's directly to my left, your right, Assistant Professor and Director of the Center for LGBTQ plus Health Equity at University of Southern California, Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work. I may have mispronounced that. Dr. Blosnich.
Thank you. So when I think about my position as, gay, cisgender man, also biracial. My mother is from Vietnam and my dad is white. So I often sort of joke that I'm a product of war, which is accurate, but also really off-putting for people. And it's sort of, all of those identities mixed together where I grew up in a very rural place in Pennsylvania was not easy. The irony of all of that was I spent a lot of time I also sort of joke that I spent my adolescence in a fugue state where I really don't know who that person was because I spent so much of it as somebody else, pretending to be straight because you just want to survive to get out of there, and really eschewing this biracial identity that I had, because when you grow up in a place that's 95% white, any slight shade of your skin is called out by anybody. And all of that together sort of informed and directed me in ways I wasn't aware of then, and I'm still sort of discovering now in adulthood even, about where I was placed, how I place all of that and what I want to do. And sort of coming out of places of fear, places of trying to melt into the background and not be seen, and bringing that forward and then working with communities to figure that out too, while also knowing my place.
Thank you. I want to take a break here from those that are on the stage to introduce a panelist that's joining us via Zoom, Dr. Wael Al-Dalami from the University of California, San Diego. If you could please share your positionality and how that impacts your work.
Thank you. Do you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. For some reason, I'm not allowed to start my video because the host has stopped it. So I'll just speak, and you can imagine how I look like maybe. I am a person who came as an immigrant to the United States from my native Iraq, which I am calling now from now. I'm in Baghdad, Iraq, to attend to my sick father, and otherwise I would have been in person with all of you. And I'm also a Muslim, and so my positionality is that I have seen in my native country a lot of injustice, and that drove my desire to make a difference and change and address injustice in my work, and especially social injustice, environmental injustice, communities that are vulnerable. So my work has focused mostly on refugees and immigrants, but also on disparity, working with Native Americans and indigenous populations. And that has really driven me to address this and other topics. I'm an epidemiologist by training, but I see epidemiology as a tool that can be applied to wherever there's a need. So that's why I shifted from tobacco control to mental health to climate change. And I don't know what's going to be next, but I'm always moving my work wherever there's a need.
Thank you. I want to go now to Dr. Goleen Samari, Assistant Professor of Population and Family Health at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health.
Thank you. So I'm Goleen Samari, and I'm a cisgender woman. I'm the daughter of immigrants. So my family originates from Iran. I'm raised and born in the United States because of political conflict. And having the classic sort of immigrant experience, the Muslim immigrant experience, really drives a lot of what I do, and speaking about things like the double burden of being a population that experiences anti-Muslim and anti-Middle Eastern racism, but then is really invisible in research and social justice work. And so a lot of what drives that is sort of my personal narrative after 9/11 as an adolescent, starting to be told to go back to where you're from and not knowing what that truly means. Like, what does it mean? People are constantly telling me to go back to where I'm from. I was born in Texas, so I don't quite know where to go. And that's a common immigrant sort of narrative. And then to have those experiences and to not see it really reflected in our prevention work and our health work has really driven a lot of my sort of need to write about anti-Muslim racism, write about Islamophobia, and really elevate that in the work that I do. So yeah.
Thank you. And last but definitely not least, Dr. Donald Edmondson, Associate Professor of Behavioral Medicine and Director of the Center for Behavioral Cardiovascular Health, Columbia University Department of Psychiatry.
Thank you. I'm Don Edmondson. I'm a white cis man who is pansexual and married to a transgender queer person. It's the first time I've actually said that in a professional setting, but my work is, my job, I think, as a person with a ton of privilege, is to align myself with folks doing important work who don't have the level of privilege I do. And so I try to bring what I have and my resources to different things. So my work is on trans and gender nonconforming health disparities, but also the climate change work and other things with cardiovascular disease risk. And growing up in Arkansas, growing up in a place that's heavily segregated and in a Southern Baptist sort of setting, a lot of old stuff to unwind, but having this accent allows me, for the vast majority of people, white folks that I run across, feel very comfortable talking to me. And I think I can give messages to people that they're more willing to listen to me sometimes than they are to other folks. So I try to do that.
Thank you. And because I think positionality matters, I just want to note that I am a Black cisgendered woman who grew up 6 generations removed from American slavery in the racist territory of South Carolina, with descendants on one side of my family. My mother's family received their 40 acres and a mule. My father's family had it stolen from them. And so that informs how I both see the world and how I move through the world. It also informs the ways in which I think about my own political beliefs when I'm trying to research such a politicized topic. And so as I put that question onto the table, what I'm going to do for the panelists is I will just choose someone to be the first one to answer the question, and then I will open it up without having to call on people like a classroom for whoever would like to answer. And when it kind of dies down with conversation, then I'll introduce another question into the conversation. And so I'll start with Executive Director Flynn. So how do you manage your own political beliefs and views when researching such a politicized topic?
Well, fortunately, I don't have to worry as much about the research side of it. And I think I'm glad to hear that people are thinking about how your positionality influences your research, because I think it most definitely does. But I'm more of a communicator, educator, coach. I'm a person that is placed to replicate myself and grow more change agents to build a critical mass of change within a city government. And so I think that for me, it's more about how do I both use my political views and my life experiences to advance or to influence people in my conversations with them. And when my political views get in the way of me being able to connect with them. So I have to constantly, and it's not, again, I never hide who I am. You may already know that I'm pretty forthright. So I'm not actually trying to code switch all the time. I'm just being thoughtful about what I lead with, right? If I'm coming into conversation with someone about race, gender, oppression, et cetera, and I suspect or don't know what their political views are, I explore that. And I can lean in more when I find that we're on the same page, right? We can just go there real fast. If not, then I might have to take a little more, I might have to be more strategic about how I get close to them, because this is relationship work at the end of the day. And there are some people that are just going to be repelled from me without me saying anything. And I have to accept that, because they're going to assume what my political beliefs are, right? They're going to make assumptions. So I also make space for that. So it's really about those kinds of, some people call that emotional intelligence, I think, or something like that. It's like really leaning into figuring out what would be effective here and what would move us forward.
I don't separate these things in my work because I'm in the field of public health. I'm public health trained. I'm a population health demographer. Public health is a field of social justice. And I don't think that we can move the needle by shying away from difficult sociopolitical context. In fact, I think we have to lead the way to actually make and enact changes that for some people seem radical, but for us, it's foundational to what we do. And so for me, I've had pushback when, I write about something that's politically charged or I lead with it. And then if I do get that pushback, then that's not the place for the work. Or sometimes I push back in response and say, you're mistaken. This is the right messaging. This is the way we should be moving. And so I always aim to kind of merge the two and not shy away from it, because I think it's fundamental to what we do.
As a tenured white cis professor who's also a man, I think it's the responsibility of people like me to lead out and be explicit and sort of be really clear about my political positions, particularly if they're able to provide cover for other folks who have less privilege. So, I try to do it like Executive Director said, with some emotional intelligence. Yeah.
And I think to echo what Goleen was saying, admitting it and not trying to divorce yourself from it, and sort of working with students who are really activated to do this work, to do this hard research, and then hearing them sort of having these similar concerns, but trying to bring them around to, things that they're learning in stats classes, and you have to be super objective. You have to, have designs where the researcher is not interfering with this. We have to temper that for sure with the realities that, to coin a phrase, the personal is political, and sort of encouraging them to figure out their place in it, really. And sort of in my own way of thinking about it, in my upbringing, my grandmother kind of helped to raise us, and she, suffered no fools and had a very good talent for profanity. So I unfortunately picked up both of those talents. Thank you, Mom. So I knew as an advocate, I'm not the person to go stand in front of legislators and try to make an appeal, but I'm like, I can be in the background and I can tell me what you need to know, and I will do the study. I will figure it out, and I will give you advocates the numbers to go and do that part. So I think another part of honing that political identity is figuring out where you fit in that process, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I would agree with everything that's been said. I think it's really hard to separate, and I think it helps us ask better questions, coming from this political space. But I do think it takes understanding all of the issues from every side, really getting outside of our comfort zone, as uncomfortable as that may be, talking to people who don't have the same political views, and really being able to come back when your work is criticized, and just having that understanding is key. I think also really, remembering the outcome. So if the research is not showing what we expect, or maybe it's counter to what we hypothesized, just keeping in mind that it's not one study, it's not one intervention that makes a difference. It may still work. It's just an issue of context. Maybe the policy or the prevention program doesn't work in this context. And so staying true to yourself, your professional identity, and the outcome and justice at the end game. And then I think finally, a lot of us want to, or at least I do, speed up the work we do, given the political climate, and, staying true to the science and knowing that that's, it's tough. We can't speed up research. It takes a long time. And so, but staying in the conversation while you do the important work is really important.
And Dr. Wyell, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I see my background and positionality as a value that I can utilize or put the hat that fits the community I'm reaching out to. For example, we just got the electricity on and off, so you're seeing me kind of flicker. So when I'm talking about tobacco control to a community in the Middle East, I use my Islamic upbringing and knowledge and say, it is not allowed to harm yourself, so you should quit smoking. When I am talking to, or I'm asked by communities of color, minorities, about hookah, which is propagated as a cultural thing of the Middle East, I advise that this is a ploy by the tobacco industry, and that I come from that culture, and that it is not part of the culture. It is used for that. Climate change is very polarized in the US. You have people on the Democrats or the Republicans or the right and the left, and everybody is so positioned on this. And I come and try and explain, I do not belong to any of these positions. I come with my own position and background, but here are the facts about climate, and that it will affect everyone, and that everybody has an ethical responsibility, whether on the right or the left, to address it. And so on and so forth, immigration, refugees. I wrote an op-ed to try and explain my position of somebody coming from the Middle East, and that people should not be upset about immigrants and refugees coming, because they have a role in that. By addressing climate change, that leads to climate refugees, and that starts from your home and so on. So I see my position as a way to forward the agenda of my research.
Thank you. Dr. Don, I want to come to you. So they gave me an overview of everyone's session, just so I can become a little familiar with your work. And the way they summarized your earlier session on climate change, they said, they summed it up in one sentence: the world is on fire and it's messing with your health. They took all your research down to that one sentence. The world is on fire, it's messing with your health. And it's definitely, I'm going to agree, it is definitely on fire. It is definitely messing with our health, but it's also messing with our work. It's also messing up our relationships with funders and publishers and the media. So if you could talk a little bit about how does the politicized nature of your research and your topic influence your work in relation to, and you don't have to answer all of them, some of them would be great, funders or publishers or even families and communities trying to understand what it is that you do and why it's so important.
I'm still in that summary, by the way. Thank you. I heard Wael talk about how politicized climate change is. A couple of colleagues and I actually published a paper last year in BMJ's opinion piece that the politicization of climate action in particular is overstated, that people are terrified and they, yes, are getting whatever propaganda they're getting. And sometimes that warps that fear into whatever reaction that people have. But for the most part, it's less politicized than we often think that it is. That said, I try to put a lot of effort into honing in on those things that are not politicized. This is such a massive problem. It's so complex. That there are things that someone from literally any position can contribute to improve the situation. One of the things that I've really appreciated about NIH over the past couple of years, our work is primarily funded by the National Institutes of Health, and the program officers that I've interacted with, folks up and down that organization, have really sort of dug in to understand climate change and how it's impacting every one of their portfolios. And I've seen a noticeable shift over the last number of years, particularly around also understanding the intersection of climate change and health disparities and how important it is on that front. And so in some ways, it's deepened my relationship to some folks at NIH, just because we're all human beings. And when we have to sit in that sort of existential fear and connect with someone on how we're going to do something about it, it can often give us an opportunity to see each other for a minute.
So I am an abortion researcher and I am a racism researcher. And for a lot of funders, can't even say those words. So to navigate the funding landscape, you have to use proxy language. I say things like, now you can say racism because of the murder of George Floyd and the resurgence of attention to the issue. But for a long time, you couldn't even say structural racism. You would say, I don't know, socio-political environment. For abortion research, it's still, you can't say I am an abortion researcher confidently, I think, to a room of funders and expect them all to take interest. And it's a difficult thing to navigate. I'm not going to say that it's easy. It's a difficult thing to navigate as a junior person who's moving a program of research forward and trying to get funding and have a social impact and not derail your career while you're doing that and be true to your identity and the social justice mission of public health. Yeah, that's not easy. Like, who can manage that? But if you believe in the lines of research that you do, I believe in the right to an abortion. I believe that we all have to be anti-racist and research practice every day. It's a lifelong mission. Then you kind of learn to navigate and bend in ways that are still true to you, but sort of meet the funders' needs at where they are politically.
Dr. Wael, did you want to comment on that?
I don't have anything to comment now.
Okay, no problem. I just don't want to forget you since I'm only imagining what you're looking like at this moment.
I
So-
put you on video.
So Dr. Catherine, did you want to add to
Can
this?
we add into
You
this
can,
question?
absolutely.
Yeah, definitely agree with all of this. It's complicated and it's hard to navigate. I would say, really keeping it simple is key too. How do we message things in a way that can help us navigate it? And thankfully we can use more, terminologies that speak to this, but I think we still have a long way to go with our language. Disparities really hides the fact that a lot of these differences are unjust. And so using inequity versus disparities, really being intentional on that. I think, navigating funding is tough, especially some of our federal funders, many of them are outcome based. So I work a lot in the violence prevention space. There's no National Institute for Violence Prevention, for example, or racism. And so how do you couch your work to an outcome to make it attractive from a funding angle? It takes a dance. So I think creativity is key. Communication is key, keeping it simple again for family, for friends. They can be some of your best audience for your message and how you test this out, particularly if they lean to the other side. And then finally, I would say, navigating what you work on politically in the media is really challenging. And, working with your PR team to vet reporters when when you do get calls for interviews, they can help you quite a bit to know who to talk to. You want to talk to the other side, but you also don't want to be chewed up and spit out. And so really preparing us for those conversations is really important. And it's not something they train us on in public health, how to communicate. So just want to add that.
Thank you. So I'm the mother of two sons, 20 and 22. And when they were growing up, we used to play this game. We were thinking about what does it mean to raise your sons, in my case, to be social justice activists. This is something that when other children were building blocks, we were like, how do we tear down the system? We, instead of, playing duck, duck, goose, it was like, how do we do a march? So they've learned this along the way, but one of the things we would often do with them is we would line them up before they went to school, sending them, my young Black sons, into an all-white environment. And I would tap them on the chest and I would say, integritas. In other words, maintain your integrity. No matter what's happening, just keep it with you. And now that they're graduating from college, they're often like, integritas. I'm like, yeah, but you're looking for a job off my dollar. But yes, maintain your integrity because it matters. I bring that up because as researchers within this politicized topic and environment, maintaining our integrity, even while we're doing, as Dr. Catherine said, doing the dance to try to get funding, is something we have to wrestle with. So I want to follow back up with you, Dr. Catherine, have you just pick up on that, because as researchers, how do we and how can we maintain the integrity of our work within these politicized climates?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, also not trying to fit your work into the funding bucket, right? Staying true to what you do want to ask and what you do want to study is really important. And, again, like I said, really knowing the urgency of the issues, but staying true to the science and the validity of what we do and really honing in on that. I think from a dissemination perspective, it's really hard, right? I mean, you can be as careful and as carefully craft what you want to say as careful as possible, but it's going to take a life of its own, even if you don't talk to the other side. And so maintaining the integrity as it's being disseminated, I think is the biggest challenge for a lot of this work.
I think it begins with knowing what your bottom line is. And I think there's a way in which we can sleepwalk through our lives, never actually having decided what is the line I won't cross, not for a job, not for a dollar, not for a promise of promotion or tenure in many cases. I think if you don't know, it's that old saying, if you don't know what you stand for, you'll fall for anything, right? You end up chasing money down the wrong avenues and end up in buckets where you don't belong because there was some money there that you could get, but then you're not doing what you wanted to do, right? It's so easy for that to happen. Now, along the way, sometimes we do have to make compromises or code, in order to get resources that we need, that I don't think that's off the table. I'm saying that when I'm coding or when I'm using my emotional intelligence to work, and I work in a political environment, I work for elected officials, for mayors and city council members. So sometimes I have to communicate to them, right, about this work. And so when I make those decisions to code or I have to remember how much of that to do before I've gotten off my bottom line. And when I get to that point, I have to stop, even if it means my job or if it means I'm not going to get that additional resource that I think I need. And what I keep in mind about that is, and I'm not always perfect at it, but what I keep in mind about that is this job isn't worth having if I can't do this job the way it needs to be done. I remember why I came, why I relocated and left all my family in another city. I remember, whatever it is, I have to remind myself of that I took this job with purpose. So it's that idea of having a purposeful life, navigating the tensions, and you will have to do that, of course, but knowing at what point you would walk away. It's also like that in negotiations, right? If you've ever been taught how to negotiate, don't go into a negotiation not knowing when you would walk away from the table, because you will lose. It just changes everything. It changes how you move. It changes. Yeah. That's what I think.
And I think building off of that, for researchers and how we think about and convey our research, being able, actually being willing and, to Goleen's point, if a journal or if a venue doesn't want to hear this point where we actually explain the measurements that we have and how imperfect they are and what they stand for. So being a researcher and putting into your work that race is a proxy variable in this study for racism, because we didn't get information about racism. We didn't measure intergenerational poverty. Sexual orientation is a stand-in for heterosexism, discrimination, things we don't measure. We're only seeing them because we measure this quality of a person's identity at which these, isms are leveled. And readers and definitely folks who want to hijack your research can jump onto that. And it doesn't mean if you put it in there, they won't try to do that. But it means that you've at least taken a stand in your own work, regardless of what a reviewer might say, regardless of what an editor might say, that, well, this seems like an odd sentence to put in there. I don't care. It'll be in there. And if it's not for this journal, I'll go to another journal. There's a lot of journals out there. So I think making those decisions, as Darlene had put, and knowing where you sort of stand with your research, or at least research and sort of what I do, and how you want to portray that to the world.
For me, during my talk, I talked a bit about the collective we have. The Center for Behavioral Cardiovascular Health is my center, and it's really a beautiful collective. We have 13 faculty and fellows and a whole bunch of staff. And for the last 5 years, we've gotten really, really good at talking to one another about hard things and determining together what our goals are, what our values are, what we're doing there together. How we should use our time. And as much as I loved everything that everyone up here said about maintaining one's integrity, sometimes it's hard to maintain one's integrity alone, to feel isolated and standing against what feel like powerful forces arrayed against you. But when you have a whole bunch of folks that have explicitly stood by you and developed those bottom lines together, it's much, much easier to say, nope, that's just not what we do.
Can I add something?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think the question about how to maintain integrity is a day-to-day challenge for all researchers, but also for us who are addressing very, politicized or controversial topics, or topics that could lend its way to undermining the integrity of researchers. I'll give a few examples. When I was working on tobacco research and known in this field, I received an invitation for a first-class travel to a resort in Switzerland to discuss research on tobacco, which sounded very unusual for academia. And I wasn't happy about it, so I inquired, and it turned out it was tobacco industry that was trying to buy people who are researchers through this indirect way, through proxies. And of course, I rejected that. I got several invitations in this area. There's so much funding from this industry or that industry, and I did not feel that I would be impartial by doing that. This kind of eventually drove me to actually be a leader in research ethics. So I am now funded to train others across the globe and locally at the university on responsible conduct of research, driven by my values and what I see that is a need. Even though I'm not a philosopher, I was never trained. I kind of learned this through the values of do to others what you would like others to do to you, which is the golden rule. And that's how I maintain my integrity and encourage my students and others who I train.
Thank you. We want to invite people to the mics. There are two of them, both in the middle aisles here. So if you have a question, please feel free to join us at the mic, and I will call on folks as we go along. While people are getting their questions together and getting to the mic, I want to put another question onto the floor. When we talk about the critical next areas of research, and have you think about that, because I do think that does determine how we move, trying to think about where are we going from here. I mean, it's so easy to get caught in the moment of the research, but we have to think forward, like where are we taking the research beyond this moment? And so I want to just invite Dr. Goleen back into the conversation to ask you to just kind of think with us out loud. What is the next critical area of research in the work you do, both in, of course, abortion research, which I really want to talk more with you about that, and doing racism research. And I believe there was someone who moved back to ask a question. I'll come to you next. Thank you.
I'm going to try to not talk for half an hour on this topic. But briefly, we're at a really interesting nexus in the abortion research world, given the legal changes of the last year. And thinking about that from a research standpoint, questions arise like, when you're doing research in places where abortion is not legal, how do you protect your participants? Is an IRB sufficient? Is a certificate of confidentiality sufficient? How do you engage in community-based and clinic-based research that doesn't put people at risk? And I think in that space, we're drawing on a lot of lessons learned in other parts of the world where abortion has been restricted for a long time and abortion research has continued. And so there's a lot of questions about the structure of studies, the IRB approvals around studies and things of that nature that I think from a research lens is really interesting. I think abortion researchers who've been in this space for a long time are committed to doing the work and doing it in a really ethical and sound way to continue to show the toll that a sort of restrictive legal and criminalization landscape can take on the lives of the most marginalized, historically marginalized, and historically underserved communities. It's a sad and scary time for us because we know the toll that it can take, and continuing to show that is painful for both the people who are experiencing that and for us. And so it's really, how can we leverage that to enact policy change? Like, we move backwards in a way. So how do we now move forward in a way that is beneficial for people? In the racism space, there's been a resurgence of attention to structural racism, as you all know, in the last 10 years, and increasing attention in this space, which is nice to see. My biggest, I guess, concern moving forward is to see that attention, that funding, that media coverage sustained. It's been, 3 years since the murder of George Floyd. And if you look at sort of the media coverage that's progressed over time, you see that it kind of wanes and lessens. If you see institutional DEI and initiatives, they've kind of like started to wane and not be as active. And so the question is, how can we keep these efforts sustained moving forward? Because again, it's lifelong work, and will require numerous people doing this work forever, if not everybody.
I'll go to the person. Dr. Wyall, are you speaking? Okay, I'll have you ask your question, and then I want to keep coming back to that as we go through asking the panelists to take us through the next critical area in your research. Thank you for your question.
Hello, thank you so much for being panelists. This is very informative. I wrote a question down. I hope it makes sense. It's kind of like a two-part question. It's how are you staying politically informed, and what training did you receive to hold the political perspectives that inform your work?
Thank you very much.
I gave up social media many years ago. So I kind of missed the days of, as a kid, I remember my grandmother would wake up at like 4 a.m. And wait for the paper to get delivered. And so, thinking about years and years ago, how, it was just scrolling for everything, returning back to just like newspapers for me is how I stay politically informed. I find like cable news shouting not helpful at all anymore. And it's actually a very well-framed question. So thank you for that, because it feels like we're at a period where we're just drowning in things that is masquerading as news, that's really just designed to outrage us. It's facts dressed as outrage dressed as facts. And I forget the second part of the question, I'm sorry, but
What type of training did you go through to help inform your political ideas?
Growing up in Greene County, Pennsylvania, is sort of the training that I had, I think. So my family is interestingly very conservative libertarian, and then also with very thin threads of kind of progressive liberalism. And I think a lot of, I didn't have any formal training in this. I feel like when I think back on it, it's kind of weird. I feel like my parents didn't guide me in one way or another. When I hear about, people tell me like they were kind of like legacy, like, I did this so my parents did it. I don't remember that ever being the case when I was growing up. And for better or worse, I forged sort of that on my own. So yeah, I don't know what other folks' experiences are.
So I was really intentional with my graduate training. I'll start there. I have a master's in Islamic studies because I knew that I wanted to focus on communities in and from the Middle East and North Africa, and not to limit the Muslim population of the world to that region. But it was important for me to have training in that, but more specifically training in an area studies program that is in the humanities and bringing that humanities lens to the social science work that I do. And so that has really informed the way that I approach things, the methods that I use, and drawing from a little bit more of what the arts and humanities have to offer. And I totally want to second what John says. I think I rely now a lot on newspapers and written forms of media as my primary source of information, and our students. Like, what an incredible resource to keep politically informed, because they will be the first to tell you if you are off base, or if you don't know the latest thing, or if you're not responding to it, or your institution is not responding to it in a way that is important and resonates with their generation. So yeah.
Well, I think that certainly my life experience as a mixed race person embedded in Black community it has informed my politics greatly. And so that leads me to say that if that's not your experience, proximity is very important. Proximity to people who are most hurt by the politics of this nation. And I don't have a lot of formal training, so I wasn't educated in this area, but in my youth, I was an active Democrat. So I learned to understand how democratic, small d democratic politics works from the grassroots up. And of course, not very well, but it still matters. And so I think I think the best lessons are not necessarily learned in the classroom. It is through reading other people's works, people with different perspectives, people who have had different experiences than mine, so that my political attitudes and beliefs are advised in a multicultural fashion, and also drawing from my experience, but being engaged, being in proximity, doing work in community, I think is the way that you ground it in a kind of reality. And I think there was another question that came before that. I would say this also has to do with how to make your research more relevant, or to handle some of the challenges, is to connect it to the people. And I know that often academic work and research work, which I use heavily in my work and appreciate so much, is also quite ungrounded. So what we had to do was we had to add the narratives to the data, to the numbers, because it's really easy to misuse numbers that are not framed up with a good, solid, strong story. So y'all should be able to tell that story. And in order to be able to tell that story along with your research, you're going to have to get out of your, whatever your box is, and gather stories and perspectives from other environments. So this is just, I don't think we're going to get social justice by staying away from the people that we say we're trying to serve and being accountable to them. So my politics also has to be accountable to them, and that's a big bucket, certainly Black people. The other thing I would say as a Black woman is show up for Black women, stand by Black women. You'll learn a lot. They will tell you truth if you get their trust. They will not tell you truth if you don't. So don't think that just because you know a Black woman that you know what she's thinking. I guarantee you don't. So until you have an authentic enough relationship that she's talking to you about the real truth that she's living, whatever environment you're in. And so, yeah, all of that, you have to get in the water if you want to really have a well-informed view of any kind, including a researcher view.
Yeah, thanks. Start first, I guess, with training. No training in how to really stay updated on these things. I would echo what others have said in terms of, national media, and to understand the other side. If you really want some comedy, get a bag of popcorn and watch Fox News to understand some of the political arguments. But I think also it depends on the level. Of course, nationally, it's maybe easier to stay ahead of the game and abreast of things. Locally is a little more challenging, but in either case, there are a lot of legislative updates, listservs, things you can get on that will keep you updated on, the latest and greatest, even locally. So look out for those.
Real quick, I had some training. I did a history degree at a small Southern Baptist university. So I got a lot of the tools of being able to go through information, sort of political stuff. But then had to listen to close friends afterwards that sort of deprogrammed some of the things that I learned previously. But today, I think one of the beautiful things that's grown out of the social media explosion is that there are people, whether it's on Substack or Ghost or whatever, who are reporters who are laser focused on one issue. So for example, if I didn't follow Erin in the Morning, and I cannot remember her last name for some reason, but if you Google Erin in the Morning, she's a trans woman who is incredibly amazing at following all the anti-trans legislation around the country, knows precisely where it is. Her wife is a legislator as well, a trans woman, and she's just amazing. So anything I need to know about what's going on in the anti-trans world, I look to Erin in the Morning. There are people who do just climate justice, and that I similarly pay $5 or $10 a month to always know from their perspective what's going on in the world. And if you do that, 4 or 5 times on the things that you care about the most, then you know what you're getting, because the New York Times is not going to be the place that I'm going to get my updates on what's going on in the trans legislation space.
Dr. Wyell?
Yes, thank you. I think this is a great question. I always get asked similar questions from my students saying, I want to do this and this, which courses I should take to help me in my career. And I say, it doesn't matter which course you take. These are tools. They will be used by you to drive whatever you want to do. So like you heard, all of us, we never got training in communication, advocacy, or any of the aspects that are related to justice and communication. We learned it by ourselves. I recall my first exposure to this. I was a PhD student in New Zealand, and I was very moved by the sanctions against my native country, Iraq, and the suffering and the death from sanctions. So I saw peace activists protesting in parliament for that. And I joined them. And one of their leaders said, introduced myself. And he said, what are you doing in the streets? You have the power. You're a physician, public health professional. You can move things way better than in the streets. And that was a turning point. I formed an organization. We advocated, we wrote op-eds, we had meetings, we reached out to politicians, and we actually moved the country's position to become against the sanctions because of that, because of the public health evidence. It wasn't advocacy, it was evidence-based advocacy, which is different. When I moved to the US, I was a postdoc at Harvard, I realized the US is a totally different political system. There is no interest in small groups and opinions, and you cannot talk to politicians like it was in New Zealand, the parliamentary kind of system. There are lobbyists and so on. So I said, I threw up my hand. I said, no, I can't compete with all of this, vested labor, advocates. So I focused on communities. I focused on working with the people who are going to make a difference one step at a time. That is what is rewarding. And I do still write op-eds, I still communicate, but I don't and never had a social media account, believe it or not. And my news media, I always take it from alternative media and then make my judgment, because the truth is always somewhere in the middle.
Thank you. That was a great question. I was actually thinking deeply about what you were saying and what you were asking, which was a two-part question, but it felt just very similar. Because when I think about my education, I went into college, I attended the HBCU, knowing what I believed. I'm the daughter of a civil rights movement activist. I knew exactly what I needed to believe. The world is racist, and that my job is try to attack it as much as possible, knowing I'll probably never help to end it. So education just gave me the language I needed to define who I was and what I was doing. I consume a lot of news. As a radio host, I probably get a stack of 75 to 100 pages every morning that I have to read before I go on the air at 2 p.m. And I'm agreeing with Dr. Wael. The truth is somewhere in the middle between social media and the New York Times, which there are days when it seems like it's the same thing, trying to figure out where the middle is. So I'll come back, if we don't have another question, to the question I put on the table. And we're moving toward the end here. Someone is standing up here. I'll give you an opportunity if you want to ask your question before we begin to give our panelists another chance to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. That's so kind. First of all, thank you so much to the panelists for sticking around at the conference to the last day. Some of you, this has been such a wonderful dialogue. I'm struck by the fact that, we focused mostly on research. Certainly we're at a research conference, but many of us in the room are also educators. And of course, there are attacks in education right now on our ability to talk about these really important topics. I teach at Washington State University. I have colleagues 8 miles away across the border in northern Idaho at University of Idaho, where it's illegal to teach and talk about critical race theory in the classroom. So I'm just curious if we could talk a little bit about the implications for teaching. And I think most of the panelists are in states like mine where that's not the case. So I'd be curious too, if people in the room are interested in sharing their experiences, the challenges, and kind of the strategies they're using in those circumstances. Thanks.
I could say something.
Thank you.
I think this is a really tough time for educators too. And, schools are my heart, and teachers are the lifeblood of the schools, and they are under threat and under attack in many places. And I do popular education, popular adult education that is based on critical race theory. And so I'm looking over my shoulder pretty constantly right now because I have a level of visibility that, and there's a very organized methodology that's being used to attack people that are doing this kind of work. Whether you're in a red state or a blue state, they're going to get to us. I guarantee you they're well funded. And so we're all in the same boat, I guess is what I'm saying. It just reads differently depending on our location. So I think this is where the collective work that we need to be doing together to move collectively to save our democracy is probably what our primary focus is. And in the meanwhile, we're going to be doing the best we can to cling to our ethics and our guiding stars, our North Stars. But it's important for us to keep our jobs. It's important for us to be in the classroom. And when it comes to those kinds of threats, there will have to be some compromises made probably for a while. So I think this is a place where you can, again, get in proximity with people who are trying to save our democracy, join the collective, and let's get busy. I just don't know any other way out. We've got to turn the ship around because otherwise it's going to keep coming and coming and coming. It's going to keep building. We slept on it a little bit since the civil rights movement, and we allowed this movement to get a 40-year, 50-year, 60-year head start on us. So I think this is a place where you have to take that long view, that 100-year view, and say, what is it we need to do to get this back on track? Because if you step too far out of line, you're unemployed, you're poor, you're homeless, I mean, none of us want that future, right? So it's about where can I take my activism and where can I make the most of it and still keep, feed my children. That's important, but I might have to take my activism out of the classroom for the moment. And that's it. And then around that, you have to take care of yourself because it's going to break your heart, right? That's a heartbreaking decision to have to make. So make sure that you have a practice that will keep you strong and whole, and that you have a place to exercise your activism to change the world if you can't do as much of it in the classroom as you used to be able to do until we get it back where it needs to be. And I don't think it has to take very long if we all get busy.
Yeah, and I think we as researchers, adding to this fight and adding research, even though, some may not pay attention to the evidence or the science behind it, but how do we use our tools in that space? And, find those within this fight that can help within the fight and really, whether it's, one congressperson or anyway, it's tough. It's a long game. So scary. It's scary.
I will add that there are organizations that are actively doing the work. I mean, I would put down on the table Freedom to Learn. Freedom to Learn is a national organization, and it's compiled of everyone from artists to activists to professors who have decided that we're going to draw the line in the sand, that we're not going to allow it to go any farther than it's gone, knowing that things will never be back to what they used to be. That day is gone. What we're trying to create now is something different because it will never go back. So I would argue that maybe a way that we do this is that we align ourselves with people who are already doing the work. And Freedom to Learn is very, very active. And I'm more than willing to meet with anyone who wants to talk about it because I'm a part of the organizing committee. We've said we're going to fight. And that means that for some of us, if the line in the sand means I'm not going to be able to continue to work at this university, then that's what I'm willing to do. And for those who are not willing to take that stand, then we cover and protect you. But there are people who are saying no more. It's not going to work for anyone. So with that in mind, let's talk about what is working as we give our panelists, who I've thoroughly enjoyed just listening to more of your research, in the last 10 minutes we have left, and we'll always stop what we're doing up here. If anyone steps to the mic, we definitely will prioritize your question because we want to hear from you. But I want to go through, and I'll just start down with Dr. Don, just asking you to share 2 or 3 suggestions for conducting work in your area. And then we'll take it down through. When we get to Dr. Catherine, then we'll go to Dr. Wael, and then we'll wrap up from there.
Thank you. I have been, first off, this has been really great, and I appreciate how you've led this. It's fantastic. But I wanted to jump on something that Director Flynn said a second ago. About the fear of losing our jobs, being left with nothing if we step too far out of line. And I think one of the next directions or the what's coming in my field I'm going to try to say this in the most comprehensible way I can. But this notion of collective, I think between research that we've seen, thinkers that have been laying out the connections between sort of brutal capitalism that the United States was founded on and continues to espouse, structural racism, anti-queer, anti-trans, these sort of creation of enemies, that the way that it works to keep us, whether it's changing our research or not teaching, is that it isolates us in these sort of atomized structures. And I think that particularly the generations that are coming up have recognized the interconnection between these systems of oppression, and are already working to create lives that eschew those constraints. So you see polyamory, having multiple partners, sharing the thing that we all hold on most tightly, the thing that we're told cannot be shared, the romantic love of another person. You see that the number of intentional communities in the United States doubled over a 5-year span last decade, and is continuing to grow. We saw through COVID, we're seeing now through climate disasters, when people need to rebuild, when people need to feel protected, they pull together, and PULL together and POOL together. Whether it's the resurgence of labor unions or rethinking how we do our research and think about the credit for our research, it strikes me that the only way forward on all of these maybe forever problems is to recommit ourselves to community, to collective, and do the research necessary so that when people ask me, how can I not participate in these systems in the ways that everyone seems to be forced to participate in them, then we might have a better answer. I think that's a great direction for climate research, for justice research, and that's probably the best I have.
I'm gonna take this in a little bit of a different direction, but still answer the question. So I'm gonna talk about 3 things that sort of give me hope moving forward. So first, this next generation that's coming up and that we have the privilege of teaching in classrooms, many of us, and partnering with research. We don't have to teach them that structural oppression is a thing. We don't have to teach them that intersectionality is a thing. They come with some of that knowledge and ready to sort of absorb that information and ready to take action and are hungry to take action and enact change. And that's really inspiring, and gaining whatever skills that I can to ensure that I am elevating and reaching that generation is important and gives me hope. Another thing that gives me hope, a second thing, is that, when I first started doing the work that I did, a lot of people were, I said, I want to research the health of Middle Eastern and Muslim communities. And so many people said, oh, that's not a thing, or that's not relevant. That's not an area of public health research. And so I made it an area of public health research. And so now, I had the privilege of speaking on a panel yesterday about structural oppression and isms and measuring these things. And you all were so kind, and it was like so well received at the conference. But if you think about the progression of that from being sort of erased and dismissed from the research and science world to, your ideas being embraced, that gives me hope for, there's a little incremental progress. And then the last thing that really gives me hope is that we're really centering and giving justice to interdisciplinary and community-based collaborations in our work in increasing fashion. And that's the only way forward. And that doesn't mean, having a community advisory board or having one person from outside your discipline. It means doing it in really meaningful ways and changing the funding structure to make sure that those community-based organizations are included in the funding structure for the grant. And I've just seen increasing movement in that direction, and that gives me hope as well.
And I agree with all of this. And I think that maybe somewhat dismal angle I'm going to take it in is what's been stymieing me lately is, you know, in all the progress that we have made and continue to kind of chip away. It's to me, it's happening against this background of anger. And I think if you're going to get engaged in this work, at least from my experience in getting engaged in this work, it's knowing what to do with your own anger. When you're facing news stories about new policies coming out and you feel like we're moving backwards, where do you put your anger at that? And for you to take your anger and not let your anger take you, because anger is an industry now. And I think we can all conjure images of very publicized politicians who are, you know, they're just kind of husks of people because they're just consumed by anger. And anger, you know, I study suicide. I have seen and heard a lot about the worst parts of what anger drives people to say horrible things, do horrible things, think horrible things. And it's difficult to fight back that sort of base, you know, part of reacting to when you feel like you're being confronted with anger. And so for me, trying to keep focused on the progress and finding places for my own anger on almost a daily basis, to not lose sight of, you know, eyes on the prize, and that this can fuel me, but it's not going to be me.
From a research angle, sure. You know, I'd echo all of this too. I'd say, you know, really two things: embracing the complexity of moving upstream, of understanding systems and how things are connected. You know, in my own work for violence prevention, even forms of violence, we're often very siloed, right? I mean, you can't disconnect much of firearm violence from other forms. And so embracing that complexity, particularly systemically, right? Like how are these isms connected? How do we consider intersectionality is really important across the board for all of our outcomes and issues we study. I think embracing change is key too. So how do we change and remove the business as usual, particularly within our academic settings, you know, embrace methods that can allow us to embrace that complexity. They may not be traditional, they may not be what we were all schooled in, but they're what we need to really move the game forward. You know, I've argued for qualitative courses to be required in my EPI department, and, you know, we need better methods. And so we have to embrace that change, including better partnerships with community and those that are really doing the work.
Dr. Wyell, would you like to comment?
I think everybody covered the things that I would have liked to say, and really in terms of community, interdisciplinary system, science, and embracing new areas. So this is clearly an area that, or the way forward. One thing I would like to emphasize is capacity building for the new generation of researchers to be able to address these important, complex topics. For example, I was able to develop a new area in public health, which is public mental health, the first such track within a public health program, because mental health is going to be a major problem in the future, and we need the people who will be able to do and be trained to address it in an evidence base. Another area that just launched in our school, a new PhD program in implementation science, which is also another field that is growing and very important to move beyond just research for the sake of research, but research that will drive interventions and policies and implemented in communities and in health sectors and so on. So I think this is an area that I would see growing in the future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wyell. Al Delamy, who's a professor, Herbert Workman School of Public Health and Human Longevity Science, UC San Diego. Dr. Don Edmondson, Associate Professor of Behavioral Medicine and Director of the Center for Behavioral Cardiovascular Health at Columbia University's Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Goleen Samari, Assistant Professor of Population and Family Health, Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. Dr. John Blosnich, Assistant Professor and Director of the Center for LGBTQ+ Health Equity at University of Southern California, the School of Social Work. Executive Director Darlene Flynn from the City of Oakland, the Racial and Equity Department. And last, of course, definitely not least, Dr. Catherine Thial, Professor from Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. I'm Dr. Kate. Thank you so much for your time.
We need more. I just know how much.
I would also like to thank all of our panelists once again. It's always a challenge to get people who have incredibly busy schedules to step away from their work and spend some time with us. In this case, all of these panelists here were here for multiple days, and they did us we had the pleasure of having you for not one, but for 2 plenary sessions. And so we have great appreciation for your time and sharing your work with us. I also want to thank Dr. Whitehead, who graciously agreed to lead this morning's plenary session. And I thank you again for leading the session, but also really elevating the quality and the depth of today's discussion. Thank you very much.